In the mid to late 90s, the first-person shooter genre really began to take shape, and it was GoldenEye that really thrust the genre into the console limelight. Before this time, first-person shooters belonged to those of us who were PC gamers. We spent hours in front of our blurry monitors, hunched over our desks playing the early online multiplayer deathmatches on our 28K modems, doing things console games could only dream of. It's often argued that it was Doom that made first-person shooters popular, and so for many, myself included, that was the benchmark for first-person shooter games at the time. Whilst Doom clung onto that crown for longer than many people expected, it was Quake that was perhaps the first game to topple it from its crown in 1996. It's funny thinking back now because I actually remember my dad getting excited for Quake and rushing home with it on launch day and spending the best part of 2 hours or so getting the game installed to run on the PC in his study. My dad at the time was a huge fan of Doom, and so I spent hours as a kid watching him playing it, so when I saw the technical jump between that and Quake, it was like watching a whole new era begin. Quake was, if anything, darker and even gorier than Doom. The murky medieval styling to the game was something I adored, and the new additions such as being able to jump and look up and down seemed groundbreaking for the time. Fast forward to 1998, and Quake was lined up to land on Nintendo's latest console. At first I had very little interest, as by this point I'd seen my dad complete Quake many times, and so I didn't think that there would be much new to the game. But then I found out the same development team that had just made the sublime Doom 64 was making Quake for Nintendo 64, and I was instantly expecting the same level of love and improvements that we'd seen in Doom 64. Sadly, whereas Doom 64 had an entire new game, some new enemies and so on, Quake 64 is as close to a straight port of the original PC game that most people would have wanted. It's worth noting that by the time Quake was released on Nintendo 64, GoldenEye was already available and wowing gamers across the world. Turok 2 had already been announced, and first screenshots were leaking online of it. Heck, even Quake 2 on PC had been out for over 6 months by this point. So it begs the question, what was the point in porting this to Nintendo 64? Well, starting off, the basics of all old school first-person shooter games apply here. The aim of the game is to make it from start to finish, killing pretty much anything that moves, trying to stay alive, and solving some basic, but sometimes frustrating switch puzzles to continue your progression. All of the 25 levels from the PC version of the game are here, but sadly there are no new levels for Nintendo 64, not even 1 or 2 exclusive ones, which is very disappointing. There are some slightly modified levels or placement of enemies and weapons, but anyone who completed the PC game shouldn't find this version all that challenging. You won't need much strategy when taking on the game. I usually found that the best tactic is to keep moving and keep an itchy trigger finger at all times, as the AI is poor by modern standards, and even for the time of this N64 release, most game AI had come a long way. It was for me as a child that the weapon selection really caught my eye. Whereas Doom's weaponry felt like a mixture between current and future technology, Quake goes medieval on your ass, no pun intended. The selection you have here is a mix between current and classic weapons, so you have your classic weapons such as rocket launchers and shotguns, but you mix these up with axes and lightning bolts. The selection of weapons may not be as diverse as other games, but the limited weapon choice actually helps the game, and you'll quickly learn which gun to take down which specific enemies and so on. In my opinion, it was the graphics department that the game was most disappointing. 2 years after the PC release, you think that the N64 would have very little problems running the game in quite a nice resolution, but the environments, textures and detail have all been lowered, giving the game quite an ugly look. It would have been nice for the developers to have added some nice polishing touches such as some real-time lighting, especially as this was included in the Sega Saturn version of the game. But the frame rate for this Nintendo 64 version is at least high, and slowdown rarely occurs except for a few instances later in the game when there's multiple enemies on screen. It's also worth noting that the controls are surprisingly good here. Sure, nothing could beat the mouse and keyboard accuracy of the PC game, but the analog stick feels right on here, and there are a few preset button layouts to choose from which include replicas of GoldenEye and Turok, so it's quick to make yourself feel at home here. There is one crime that Quake on Nintendo 64 commits that I don't think can be forgiven, and that's the multiplayer mode. The game was actually delayed by 6 months in order for the developers to implement a multiplayer mode into the game. I don't know what happened, but the best they could work into the game is a 2-player deathmatch and no 2-player co-op campaign. For a console that already had some amazing 4-player deathmatch first-person shooters, this was a deal breaker for many potential buyers. With Doom 64, the studio decided to try an ambient soundtrack which for me was one of the highlights of the game. It offered something different as it was more about eeriness and minor noises and sound effects than the typical rock style I had grown to. Thankfully, this same style was also implemented into Quake here. Trent Reznor's original Quake soundtrack on PC was pretty cool at times, but I did feel like at times it did take away from the haunting nature that Quake really should have been. With Quake, less is certainly more, and this is a great example of how to create atmosphere in a game with little music involved. If you've already played it and completed it on PC, then there's certainly nothing this does to make you replay the game. For those who have never played Quake, then this is certainly a classic first-person shooter, but Doom 64 has a lot more to offer and it actually felt like a genuinely new game. Quake feels like it was rushed to market as damage limitation exercise after GoldenEye showed the world what the first-person shooter games of the future would look like. But how do you remember Quake? Were you an old school PC player, or did you get your first taste of Quake on consoles? It's a game which has been ported to pretty much every console, so what do you think is the best console version of the game? As always, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and until next time.